To start modelling, the first thing we need to know is how to change between vertex, edge and face. That is 1, 2 and 3 on the keyboard, or at the top left here you have your buttons to do that. If you hold shift and click over them, you can select all 3, so you can do face, edge and vertice all in one go. To extrude, the hotkey is E, and that moves up and down, and it snaps automatically to your normal. You'll notice it also, there is no gizmo when I press E. You don't really need a gizmo when you work with Blender. A lot of the time you don't have a gizmo on screen. Although, if you would like to have a gizmo, you can press Extrude Region, and it comes up with one, and you can click and drag that. This outside one doesn't lock you to your normal axis. And after you've extruded, if you select this ring here, it just lets you move. So you don't need to go into the move tool. If you want to extrude by a certain value, if you press E to extrude, and then you type in the value you want to move by, so I could type in 2. In Blender, 2 units is 2 meters, as you can see in the top left up here. 2 meters along the normal axis. But as well as just typing in values, you can do fractions or multiples, so I can do 2 divided by 3, or 2 divided by 23 as I just did. So grab Z2. And down here I can do the same, so I can do 2 divided by 3, and it puts in the value for me without having to open a calculator. So if you're using angles, you want 18 in a circle, you can do 360 divided by 18 and work that way. In Extrude, there's different tools. There is Extrude along normals and Extrude individual. And like the icons show, if I do that, it's going to extrude individually like that. By just pressing E, it doesn't do that automatically. So sometimes the buttons are helpful for very specific cases. And I got that by clicking and holding the Extrude Region button. Extrude along normals is very much the same as normal extrude, except it will also scale. So if I do that, you can see extruded along the normal of the edge, and also scaled at the same time. In Blender, you're not required to extrude and produce a face, unlike in Maya where whenever you extrude you have to have a face there. So I can extrude just the vertice, press E, and I have this floating vertice with an edge, and I can snap that to an axis by pressing Z, X and Y, or I can do that by holding middle mouse, and it brings up this axis gizmo, and I can select it by moving the mouse around and selecting an axis. I'm holding middle mouse to do this and clicking, and that creates just a vertice on its own, and I can keep working from that. Oops. And say I wanted to link this together, I press F. F is like fill, so it will take anything you have selected and the other thing you have selected and try and find a way of filling it. If you have edges, it creates n-gons, and there's better ways of filling than just F to fill. So you can fill. This extrude, working with just a vertice, doesn't seem useful initially maybe, but if you have a blueprint, so you have a shape, so if I had a pattern I'm working from, I wanted to extrude along it, I could work from it like this, and this pattern could be like an image that you've imported in, and you want to work from that like a blueprint. And I'm just pressing E, moving my mouse and clicking to confirm. The faster way of doing that would actually be this menu here, Extrude to Cursor, and that will just let you click and place your vertices wherever you want. The hotkey is doing that is pressing Control and clicking. So if you have a shape like this, and I can just delete this connection here, I have this row of edges. I can start filling that in like so, and you can create a complicated shape. You'll also notice I've got two floating geometries here that are separate but parts of the same mesh. I can separate them by pressing P and by separate by loose parts, and now each of these are separate objects. I can move them individually. Their origin, this little dot here, is the same, that it's shared across the two. To reset an origin, you can go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry, and it'll set it to the middle. Or there's other options. You can do Center of Mass, or if you want to be precise and set an origin to a specific place, you can use the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is something a bit different, and this is being a bit sidetracked from Extrude region, but it's something that's used across all of Blender. It's like a virtual pivot point. So instead of moving the actual pivot point like you do in Maya to rotate something around, you can use a 3D cursor, which is this reticle thing here. You might have it turned off, which is in viewport overlays and 3D cursor. So say I wanted to select my pivot point, my object origin, sorry, to be to here. I can go Shift and S, which brings up my cursor options, and go cursor to selected, and it'll snap it to that point. I then can go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor, and now my origin point is around that. And you can see how that will be useful. You can assign points to be your origin. The next thing with extruding is if you want to extrude along a normal, that only works if you have a face to extrude from. So all these will extrude along their normals, but this edge here doesn't automatically snap by pressing E. You can do it with the button here, extrude region, and click the icon, and it'll extrude along the normal, and you can work that way. The alternative way of doing that without using this hotkey is to go up here and transform orientations, and this is where these buttons start becoming useful. Automatically set to global. You can add your own if you want to do very specific axis, so you can create a selection and go create an orientation just for that selection, and you can work from that. I've never found that useful, but if you're doing a complicated model, you might find that that's the only way of getting the correct alignment you're after. So if I select this to normal, and now I press E, nothing appears to have changed until I press Z or X or Y, and it will try and snap it to that normal. And you can see down here how that's working. So if I press E, Z, and decide I don't want actually to be along that axis, I just want to go along the Z normal, I can work like that. If I want to extrude and extrude incrementally, I need to change my snapping option. I can change my snap to increment here. It's quite important that you have that as increment to do this. Now if I press Control, it will snap along an increment. If I press Shift at the same time, it does a smaller increment. And you'll notice my mouse sort of, as I move it up and down, flips from the top to the bottom of my screen and the other way. So you don't need to worry about going off your screen. You can keep going and it'll still work. Now this works with everything. If I press rotate and hold Control, it will snap, and holding Shift will make it a precise number. Holding Shift is always a way of giving yourself more control. So I have my extrude region and move for my last operation still here. If I hold Shift, you can see my movement's very precise, but if I let go of Shift, it becomes a bit bigger. And I say it's important to have snapping turned to increment. And that's because if you have, say, vertice on and hold control, you're going to snap to a vertice as you move, which can be useful. So if you want to extrude and then you want to snap that to a vertice to create edges like that, you can work like that, but normally increments what you want it on. The next thing probably will be deleting. So to delete in Blender is a bit different to Maya. You can't just delete a face and call it done. In that, say I have this, in Maya you just select this face, press delete, and it would go. You can't do that really in Blender. That's not how it works. Because you can extrude individual edges, that means the vertices don't rely on a face. So deleting this doesn't just delete this face. You have to delete the vertices that hold the face together at the top, or you delete the edge. Even that will leave you with vertices floating. So it's normally you normally delete with vertices. The other ones are dissolve, and that's like control delete. So if I add an edge loop, I'll go into adding that later, and press delete edge. It's going to leave me with this frame with vertices because it only deleted the edge. So if I do dissolve edges, you'll see my it deleted the vertices as well. So that's how you do deleting compared to Maya. But that's probably the biggest thing. When you start modeling, the deleting, it doesn't work the same. Before we finish with extrude, there's the transform orientation. Sorry, there's the pivot points to look at. This is where the 3D cursor comes back into place. Like with the origin of an object, you can select that, an edge, and go cursor to selected. Make sure that's on 3D cursor, and whatever you select now will rotate or scale or move from that point, or even extrude from that point. So it's like it becomes a virtual pivot point, and I can click that and apply it anywhere. The other useful ones to look at are these three bottom ones. Bounding box center isn't generally that useful. I mean, if you want to use that, you use median point normally. And I'll go through what each one does. So say I have this object, and I have another object here, and now I scale with the median point. That's the normal one you have selected. It's going to scale from the middle. If I change that to individual origins, it scales them based on their own pivot point, which is this little dot in the middle. If I have active element, the lighter color, I think it's yellow, becomes the pivot point to scale from. If I shift and right click, that becomes the active object. So it's always this color is your active object. I can even select that to be my active object, which is just a light.